On the night of April 17, 2012, a man was found dead under mysterious circumstances in room 614 of the Al-Salam Rotana Hotel in Khartoum, Sudan. That man was Bilal Shukri, a rocket engineer tied to Hamas's clandestine weapons program. His sudden death would unravel a narrative of assassination, intelligence warfare, and the razor-thin margins between life and oblivion in the shadows of espionage. The hotel was busy that evening with a mixture of businessmen, diplomats, and foreign contractors. Outside, the streets of Khartoum were heavy with desert dust and the distant rumble of generators. Inside, the air-conditioned corridors smelled of polished wood and strong coffee. The body was discovered by hotel staff after unanswered calls and suspicious silence. His face was pale, his lips tinged with blue, and beside the bed lay a stack of technical documents that would soon be whisked away by unseen hands. Sudanese authorities rushed to secure the room, but the hotel's surveillance footage from that floor showed gaps, blackouts where cameras should have been recording. Hotel guests whispered in the lobby as unmarked cars pulled up, and men in civilian clothes moved with military precision through the hallways. Within hours, conflicting stories emerged: a natural heart attack, a poisoning, or a surgical strike disguised as misfortune. For those who knew his reputation, the answer was almost obvious. The question was not if Mossad had been involved, but how. Why did this single death matter in the storm of Middle Eastern conflicts? Because Bilal Shukri was not an ordinary man. He was a weapons architect, a designer of long-range rockets that could alter the balance of power between Gaza and Israel. Every missile schematic that passed through his hands represented another step toward extending the reach of Hamas's arsenal. His presence in Sudan was no coincidence. Khartoum had become a crossroads for smugglers, financiers, and covert operatives, a staging ground where ideologies collided and weapons moved silently across borders. To Israel, Shukri represented an existential threat. Intelligence briefings had long warned that his research connected Iranian rocket designs with Gaza-based workshops. To the West, his activities signaled a widening network that could destabilize shipping routes in the Red Sea and embolden militants beyond Palestine. For Egypt, Sudan, and other regional players, his presence suggested that the invisible wars of intelligence agencies were already being fought on their soil. In his death, there was more than blood spilled on a hotel floor. There was a geopolitical tremor, reverberating from Tel Aviv to Tehran, from Washington to Cairo. The stakes were not simply about one man's breath ceasing in the dark. They were about the secrets locked inside his brain, the blueprints that might survive him, and the ripple effects of an assassination that would never officially be admitted. His death was a spark on a powder keg of espionage, proxy wars, and shadow empires. If a hotel room in Khartoum could become a battlefield, then nowhere in the modern world was beyond reach. Who silenced Bilal Shukri that April night? Was it truly the long arm of Mossad, reaching deep into Khartoum with surgical precision? Or did rival factions within Hamas itself decide that his secrets had become too dangerous to safeguard? Could it have been Sudanese intelligence, quietly purging a liability whose presence invited foreign wrath, or perhaps Iranian handlers settling scores over loyalties divided between patrons? Why then, and why there? What made room 614 the chosen stage for a performance of death and deception? Was the blackout of security cameras a technical glitch, or was it deliberate sabotage by unseen accomplices? Who else walked those corridors that night, blending into the hum of a luxury hotel while carrying out a mission that would never appear on any record? How many passports, false names, and careful alibis were woven into the plot? Did Shukri know, in his final hours, that he was already marked? Or did the end arrive as silently as the desert wind that crept around the city's edges? And above all, who gave the order and who signed the death warrant of a man whose mind was a weapon more dangerous than steel? Bilal Shukri was born in 1973 in the narrow alleys of Gaza City, a place where sand, salt, and politics mixed into the very air children breathed. His father was a schoolteacher, thin and stern, who taught mathematics with chalk-dusted hands. His mother managed the household with quiet strength, a figure of resilience who stretched meager resources to keep her children fed and clothed. In the Shukri home, discipline was prized as much as loyalty, and from early years Bilal absorbed both like scripture. The city outside offered little safety, only the constant hum of occupation, patrols, and uncertainty. The Shukri family was not wealthy, nor were they destitute. Their home was a modest stone dwelling with green shutters, always smelling of lentils, cumin, and kerosene. Electricity cuts were routine, and children did homework under candlelight, while adults discussed politics in hushed voices. The family was religious but not zealously so, carrying a balance between tradition and pragmatism. Bilal grew up watching his father argue about history, maps, and borders over tea with neighbors. He learned quickly that identity in Gaza was not simply personal, but political, a condition inherited as much as chosen. As a boy, Bilal was drawn to construction toys, puzzles, and discarded machinery. He scavenged broken radios and bicycle parts, tinkering until sparks flew or gears aligned. Neighbors recalled a child who preferred wires and bolts to football games, his imagination pulled toward invention rather than play. In school, he excelled at mathematics, physics, and the quiet art of problem-solving. Teachers noted a withdrawn personality, marked by long silences and sudden bursts of curiosity. While other boys dreamed of martyrdom or football stardom, Bilal dreamed of blueprints. Life in Gaza, however, had a way of shaping even dreamers into instruments of conflict. Military incursions, curfews, and clashes with soldiers left deep imprints on his childhood memory. He witnessed arrests, funerals, and the sting of tear gas before adolescence. These events fused with his love for engineering, creating the earliest seeds of a future where mathematics would meet militancy. For Bilal Shukri, the streets of Gaza were both a crucible and a classroom, each day teaching him lessons about power, survival, and the unspoken language of struggle. By his late teenage years, Bilal Shukri was not only a promising student, but also a man who carried the weight of ideology in every breath. His worldview hardened in the crucible of Gaza's unrelenting pressure. He saw his family's modest life as an emblem of survival, yet he believed survival alone was insufficient. He spoke of liberation, not as a dream, but as a mathematical equation, a formula requiring inputs of sacrifice, organization, and relentless pressure on the adversary. To him, weapons were not merely tools of destruction, but instruments of balance, designed to close the gap between weakness and strength. Bilal's personal habits betrayed a meticulous personality. He rose early, favoring routine over chaos, and his mornings were spent with notebooks filled with scribbled diagrams. He obsessed over efficiency, sometimes rearranging household objects for symmetry and clarity. Those who knew him claimed he ate with ritualistic order, carefully dividing his plate into measured sections. His shoes were always polished, his clothing pressed, even in the most meager conditions. Behind this order lay a restless mind, one that refused to waste energy on frivolities. Where others sought leisure, Bilal sought precision, patterns, and progress. Though he carried seriousness like a cloak, Bilal was not humorless. He enjoyed dry jokes, often muttered under his breath, designed for those clever enough to catch them. His companions described him as paradoxical, warm in private, yet icy in moments of planning. He read voraciously, ranging from Quranic exegesis to engineering manuals, from Arabic poetry to contraband technical magazines smuggled in from abroad. He possessed the habit of memorizing details, storing them like weapons in the arsenal of his mind. To him, knowledge was not leisure, but ammunition. Yet beneath the cold exterior lingered personal quirks that humanized him. He was terrified of deep water, avoiding beaches and refusing to swim. He disliked loud music, claiming it cluttered his thoughts. He collected pens obsessively, storing dozens in neat rows, each capped and ready. His handwriting was small and angular, resembling blueprints themselves. These oddities, at once trivial and revealing, offered glimpses of a man whose inner life oscillated between rigidity and fragility. He was not a mythical figure in youth, but rather a meticulous dreamer molded by hardship, one whose quirks foreshadowed the precision with which he would one day wage his private war. As Bilal Shukri grew into the circles of militancy, he acquired nicknames that both exalted and obscured him. Among close friends, he was called Al-Muhandis, the engineer, a title reserved for those whose intellect could shape battlefields as effectively as any gun. Within Hamas, Whispers referred to him as the silent architect, a man who spoke little but whose designs carried far-reaching consequences. To regional intelligence agencies, his codename shifted with every file, sometimes Blacksmith, sometimes Falcon, each chosen to signify danger hidden within meticulous craft. These titles gave him an aura of mystery, cloaking his true identity behind legend. Self-image mattered deeply to Bilal, though he would never admit it outright. He dressed with quiet precision, preferring clean shirts and modest trousers rather than flamboyant attire. His notebooks were meticulously labeled, each cover marked with dates and symbols only he understood. When photographed, he often avoided direct eye contact, as though his gaze might betray more than he wished to reveal. Yet in private moments, he sometimes referred to himself in the third person, describing the engineer as if he were a character outside his own skin. It was not vanity, but a form of detachment, a way to view himself as a tool in history's machinery. Stories circulated that he once corrected a senior commander on the mathematics of a trajectory, humiliating the man in front of others. Bilal dismissed such tales, but they revealed his self-perception, a man whose intellect granted him superiority even over those with more rank or charisma. He saw himself not as a soldier, but as a strategist, a constructor of possibilities. For him, rockets and schematics were extensions of his very identity. To dismantle his work would be to dismantle the man himself. The turning point in Bilal Shukri's life came during his university years, when his technical talent collided with the political turbulence of Gaza. Enrolled in engineering studies in the early 1990s, he was exposed not only to mathematics and physics, but also to the simmering debates of students aligned with different factions. Islamist groups courted him, sensing the value of a disciplined mind. Bilal resisted at first, preferring to bury himself in diagrams and formulas. Yet as clashes intensified on the streets and funerals for young martyrs filled the air with chants of resistance, he felt his detachment erode. Ideas became harder to separate from reality. It began innocuously, designing rudimentary devices for local activists, assisting with communications equipment, and repairing smuggled electronics. He told himself it was merely technical assistance, not political commitment. But each favor drew him deeper, and soon his skills became indispensable. When a commander asked him to evaluate makeshift mortars, Bilal provided precise calculations, improving accuracy by meters. That contribution earned him quiet recognition, and whispers began to circulate about the young engineer who could make crude weapons more lethal. The bridge between his academic life and militant networks had been crossed without ceremony. By the mid-1990s, Bilal had developed contacts with Hamas operatives who viewed him as a resource too valuable to waste. He attended clandestine meetings in dimly lit apartments, where maps and prayer books shared space on the same tables. He was never the one to shout slogans, never the loudest voice in the room. Instead, he listened, calculated, and spoke only when precision mattered. His quiet authority grew, and so did the demands placed upon him. What began as academic curiosity now transformed into active participation in a struggle that promised no return. The final step into militancy came when Israeli raids targeted his neighborhood, leaving homes shattered and blood on familiar streets. The personal became political, and Bilal's once detached intellect fused with anger. He saw in his calculations not only numbers but justice, not only trajectories but vengeance. The boy who once dismantled radios for curiosity had become a man who designed rockets for war. By the time he completed his studies, Bilal Shukri was no longer merely an engineer. He was an asset of resistance, a figure whose mind had crossed the threshold into the machinery of conflict. Bilal Shukri's transition from engineer to operative quickly attracted the attention of Israeli intelligence. His early involvement in designing improvised launchers and modifying explosives brought him under surveillance. In 1997, he was implicated in a cache of weapons discovered near Khan Yunis. Though evidence was circumstantial, his name appeared in Shin Bet reports for the first time. Shortly after, he was detained by Palestinian Authority police, under pressure from Israeli counterparts. Officially, the charge was illegal possession of restricted materials, but unofficially everyone understood it was about his growing reputation as the engineer. He was released after 3 weeks, with no conviction but greater notoriety. A second arrest came in 1999, this time orchestrated directly by Israeli forces. Soldiers raided a suspected Hamas workshop, and Bilal was caught with wiring diagrams and tools in his possession. He was interrogated for days, accused of constructing devices intended for attacks across the Green Line. Released once again due to insufficient evidence, he returned to Gaza more cautious but no less determined. Each arrest bolstered his myth within militant circles, the brilliant mind who slipped through the fingers of the occupiers, surviving their pressure and returning to his work. His resilience was read as defiance. In the early 2000s, his name became associated with the smuggling tunnels that linked Gaza with Egypt. Security services suspected him of advising on structural reinforcement, ensuring that tunnels could carry heavier loads of arms. Israeli forces intercepted communications mentioning al-Mohandis, and arrests followed. This time Bilal avoided capture by vanishing into safe houses. His ability to elude arrest reinforced his reputation as untouchable. It also convinced his allies that he was more than an asset. He was indispensable. For Israel, every failed attempt to pin charges on him transformed frustration into obsession. They saw in him the prototype of a new threat, a figure whose intellect and resourcefulness could not be neutralized through routine detentions. By the time his 30s began, Bilal's criminal file was swollen with allegations, but the lack of convictions only fueled his aura. Each time he emerged from custody, whispers within Gaza cast him as a man shielded by fate. Each time his name escaped official indictments, his legend grew louder. Arrests were meant to contain him, but instead, they elevated him into the realm of myth. From that point on, it was no longer about whether Bilal Shukri would escalate his activities, but how far he was willing to go. Interrogations stretched for weeks. Israeli intelligence sought not only blueprints but also the network of suppliers who fed his work. Bilal later claimed he endured extended sleep deprivation, exposure to freezing conditions, and relentless psychological pressure. According to testimonies shared with sympathetic media, he was shackled in stress positions, denied medical care, and subjected to threats against his family. Whether every detail was factual or embellished, the image of torture became part of his mythology, woven into the broader narrative of Palestinian suffering under occupation. His time in custody, though brief compared to others, branded him as both victim and survivor. What Israeli interrogators saw as a calculated attempt to break his will became, paradoxically, a crucible that hardened him. Friends who visited after his release noticed changes. His silence grew heavier, his posture more rigid, his eyes colder. He rarely spoke about what happened inside the detention center, but he carried scars, physical and otherwise, that shaped his ideology. Each bruise and burn was retold in whispers as evidence of his sacrifice. Each memory of humiliation became fuel for his determination. Bilal no longer viewed engineering merely as intellectual exercise. It had become weaponized faith. Stories spread in Gaza that the engineer had outlasted the torturers, refusing to reveal names or locations. Some said he hummed verses of the Quran through gritted teeth, others that he solved mathematical equations in his mind to distract himself. These stories, whether true or not, elevated him beyond the realm of ordinary men. He returned to his circle of allies, not as the same Bilal, but as a man reforged by pain, convinced that his struggle was ordained. From then on, the blueprint of every weapon he designed carried a silent oath, never to yield, never to forgive. After his release, Bilal Shukri was no longer simply an engineer dabbling in clandestine work. He was recruited formally into Hamas's military wing, the Izz ad-Din al-Qassam brigades, where his skills were treated as rare assets. In the early 2000s, as Gaza became a hotbed of militant innovation, Bilal played a central role in establishing technical units dedicated to rocketry. These were not ragtag groups with homemade devices anymore. Under his guidance, they became laboratories of war, hidden in basements, farmlands, and abandoned warehouses. Every blueprint, every schematic, every welding spark was touched by his hand. But Hamas was not the only organization courting him. Reports suggest that Islamic Jihad also sought his expertise, offering greater autonomy and resources. Bilal declined, preferring the discipline and structure of Hamas. His loyalty was not only ideological but also strategic. Hamas had the networks, the funding streams, and the infrastructure that could turn his designs into mass-produced weapons. For him, efficiency mattered more than rhetoric. He wanted his rockets not to be symbols but to be tools of leverage, objects that could alter the terms of negotiation through fear and reach. It was during this period that Bilal began training apprentices. Young men with little formal education were taught the basics of mechanics, metallurgy, and propulsion. He insisted on rigorous testing, sometimes scolding students for sloppy measurements or imprecise angles. He told them that a millimeter could be the difference between success and failure, between striking an Israeli base or merely rattling sand in the desert. His mentorship created a generation of militants who viewed engineering as a sacred duty, and who carried his methods forward even after his death. By the mid-2000s, Bilal had become both engineer and organizer. He co-founded cells responsible for importing key components through smuggling routes in Sinai, then adapted them into usable systems inside Gaza. His work bridged Iran's technological expertise with Gaza's ingenuity, creating a hybrid weapons program that alarmed Israel. Intelligence analysts noted the sudden leap in Hamas's capabilities, tracing it back to one man. In effect, Bilal Shukri had transitioned from lone tinkerer to institutional figure, embedding his skills into the very fabric of Hamas's military strategy. By 2006, Bilal Shukri's technical expertise had fused with logistical ambition. He became deeply involved in the labyrinth of smuggling operations that threaded through Sinai, Sudan, and into Gaza. Convoys of disguised trucks, sometimes carrying livestock, sometimes household goods, concealed missile parts and explosives that he had sourced through clandestine networks. Bilal coordinated with Bedouin tribesmen, Iranian intermediaries, and Sudanese middlemen, turning the desert into a highway of contraband. Israeli intelligence traced the sudden influx of advanced components, metal casings, electronic circuits, and rocket fuel precursors, back to the engineer. Each successful delivery widened his legend and Israel's frustration. Beyond smuggling, his name was whispered in connection with kidnappings. In 2006, when Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit was captured near Kerem Shalom, reports suggested Bilal had provided the technical advice for the tunnel infrastructure used in the operation. Though never publicly confirmed, the association cemented his reputation as a shadowy figure behind audacious strikes. Kidnapping for him was not random violence but a chess move, a method to trade hostages for prisoners, extracting leverage from Israel in ways rockets could not. Each abduction sent shockwaves through the region, magnifying his value within Hamas and deepening his image as a strategic mind. Killings, too, followed in his wake. Intelligence briefings allege that Bilal oversaw the design of devices used in targeted ambushes against Israeli patrols along Gaza's border. Some claimed he personally calibrated timers on improvised explosive devices that tore through armored vehicles. Others insisted his hand could be seen in the evolving accuracy of rocket attacks that shifted from rural strikes to the peripheries of Israeli towns. While he rarely appeared on the battlefield, his fingerprints were on the blueprints of death. In militant propaganda, he was portrayed not as a faceless technician, but as a warrior whose tools could rewrite the balance of fear. These escalations transformed Bilal into more than a military asset. They made him a symbol. To supporters, he was the genius engineer who turned scarcity into strength. To Israel, he was a priority target, a man whose quiet calculations threatened national security. His name moved higher on watch lists, and with every smuggled shipment, every kidnapping, and every killing, the unspoken question grew louder. How long could he evade the hunters already closing in? The timeline of Bilal Shukri's escalation reads like a ledger of shadows, each entry marked by precision and audacity. In March 2007, Israeli drones observed unusual convoys traveling north from Sudan. Weeks later, fragments of Iranian-made rockets surfaced in Gaza, their modifications traced directly to Bilal's engineering notebooks. In December 2008, during the Gaza conflict known as Operation Cast Lead, the Qassam brigades launched rockets that reached Ashkelon with unprecedented accuracy. Israeli analysts concluded that Shukri's hand had guided the technical improvements, elevating Hamas's reach from symbolic harassment to genuine strategic threat. By June 2009, Egyptian intelligence intercepted shipments of ammonium nitrate disguised as agricultural goods, destined for Gaza through Rafah tunnels. Documents seized during the bust bore Bilal's coded initials, a rare, tangible link tying him to smuggling pipelines. In September of the same year, an Israeli patrol along the border was ambushed by an IED with a timer mechanism unlike any previously used. Forensic specialists later determined it bore similarities to devices tested in Sudan, again pointing to Shukri's expanding laboratory of war. Each incident illustrated his dual existence, present in no photo, yet visible in every design. Then came April 2010, when Mossad allegedly disrupted a convoy of trucks deep in Sudanese territory, annihilating them with airstrikes. Israeli officials never admitted responsibility, but reports claimed the vehicles carried Fajr-3 rockets destined for Gaza. Among the debris were fragments of circuitry matching those found in earlier Hamas weapons. Though Bilal survived, intelligence agencies began to track his movements more closely, mapping his travels between Khartoum, Damascus, and Tehran. The picture emerging was of a man not simply hiding in Gaza, but orchestrating transnational logistics on a scale few had imagined possible. The final entries before his death came in 2011, when rockets with extended range struck near Ashdod. The Israeli Home Front Command released statements acknowledging the new caliber of threat, though without naming the source. Privately, intelligence assessments placed Bilal Shukri at the center of the storm. His methods had matured from local tinkering to international collaboration, and his reach had become intolerable to those who monitored him. Every incident marked not only his ingenuity, but also the inevitability of his fate. Each blueprint drew the noose tighter, each strike brought the hunters closer. His time as a phantom engineer was running out. By 2011, Bilal Shukri's name was no longer whispered only in Gaza's alleys or Hamas safehouses. It appeared in formal documents, etched into intelligence reports across capitals. The Israeli security agency placed him on its highest priority list of operatives, labeling him the mastermind behind the evolving rocket program that pushed Hamas's arsenal beyond short-range harassment. His profile was circulated to Western allies, who were urged to treat him as a destabilizing figure, capable of altering the region's strategic equation. From Washington to London, analysts debated his influence, noting that his skill set was rarer than any shipment of weapons. The United Nations received confidential warnings about his activities, though public acknowledgement remained absent. Within Mossad's internal files, his codename was underlined in red, a signal reserved for those deemed both elusive and indispensable to their adversaries. American agencies, though officially distant from the assassination campaigns, shared intelligence on his travel routes and financial conduits. The Europeans, reluctant but wary, added his name to watch lists that quietly restricted his movement across airports. He became in effect a man who lived on borrowed time, surrounded by maps, notebooks, and the knowledge that the world was watching. For Hamas, the international spotlight only enhanced his myth. Propaganda framed him as a David confronting Goliath, a lone engineer constructing miracles of resistance from scraps and secrecy. His blueprints were depicted as scriptures, his calculations as prayers of defiance. To Israel, however, he was the embodiment of asymmetric threat, one man's mind producing weapons capable of terrorizing cities and disrupting daily life. As his notoriety rose, so too did the sense of inevitability. Bilal Shukri was no longer just an engineer. He was a marked man. His name entered into the ledger of targets awaiting silent erasure. The first serious attempt came in late 2010, when an airstrike targeted a convoy moving through the deserts of eastern Sudan. Intelligence suggested Bilal Shukri was among the passengers. The explosion tore vehicles apart, scattering metal across the sand. Initial reports listed him as killed, yet within days, Hamas outlets announced that the engineer had survived, slipping away with minor injuries. Israeli officials refused comment, but the operation revealed two truths. Mossad knew his roots, and his survival was narrowing with every escape. Each failed strike only sharpened the determination of those pursuing him. A year later, in Damascus, another attempt reportedly unfolded. Syrian opposition figures later claimed that a mysterious poisoning had been arranged at a safe house where Bilal was meeting intermediaries. Witnesses described sudden convulsions, vomiting, and collapse. Medical intervention saved him, though the experience left him frail for weeks. To Hamas, It was proof of foreign plots against their best minds. To Mossad, it was another lesson in the difficulty of eliminating a man who trusted no one fully and changed his routines obsessively. His survival was not luck alone, it was discipline, paranoia, and an almost mathematical ability to predict danger. Drone strikes followed. In 2011, an unmanned aircraft fired missiles near Rafah, obliterating a workshop suspected of housing Bilal's operations. Intelligence sources believed he had left minutes earlier, evading death once again. Each narrow escape reinforced his myth in Gaza, the engineer whom death could not catch. But behind the mythology lay a tightening noose. Every attempt revealed patterns, narrowed locations, and confirmed that his elimination was only a matter of time. For the hunters, each failed strike was an investment in inevitability. For Bilal Shukri, each survival was both a victory and a reminder that the shadow on his shoulder would never vanish. By 2012, the rhythm of Bilal Shukri's life carried a sense of countdown. Every hotel lobby felt like a stage of surveillance, every airport line a trap waiting to spring. He rotated safe houses across Khartoum, Damascus, and Tehran, yet each move felt less like evasion and more like delay. Intelligence analysts on both sides of the conflict agreed on one fact: men like Bilal did not grow old. For Mossad, patience was strategy, and history had proven their reach relentless. For Hamas, whispers began that the engineer was living on borrowed days, his aura of invincibility now a target painted on his chest. Foreshadowing lay in the tone of media reports. Israeli newspapers carried vague hints of technical masterminds being hunted abroad. Western analysts noted the convergence of intelligence streams pointing to Sudan as his refuge. Even allies within Hamas began to speak of him with a reverence tinged by fatalism, as though they already rehearsed the eulogies. He himself seemed aware. Friends described him as more withdrawn, spending longer hours sketching designs, muttering equations under his breath, almost as if he knew he was racing against time. His notebooks filled faster, his gaze grew sharper, his routines more mechanical. The inevitability of his fate was not simply the product of Mossad's determination, but of his own importance. The more sophisticated Hamas's rockets became, the higher his value soared, and with it the urgency of his elimination. His very success wrote the script of his demise. By the spring of 2012, the question was no longer whether he would be killed, but where and how. When he checked into the Al-Salam Rotana Hotel in Khartoum, it was not merely a business trip or a temporary refuge. It was the quiet beginning of his final chapter, foreshadowed in every failed attempt before it. The story of Bilal Shukri cannot be understood in isolation, for he was a single figure in a storm stretching across decades. At its core lay the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a struggle defined by occupation, resistance, and the bitter contest over land and legitimacy. By the time Bilal reached prominence, the Second Intifada had already scarred both sides, embedding cycles of rocket fire and military retaliation into the fabric of daily life. Each new escalation was not a random act, but part of a continuum where grievances accumulated like layers of sediment. In this environment, engineers like Bilal were not anomalies but products of necessity. The broader conflict was also regional. Iran poured resources into Gaza, not solely out of solidarity, but as a strategic wedge against Israel and Western influence. Syria, under Bashar al-Assad, provided safe havens for exiled Hamas leaders, calculating that resistance credentials bolstered its regional posture. Egypt, caught between geography and politics, alternated between tolerance and suppression of Gaza's tunnel economy. Sudan emerged as a quiet corridor, its sprawling deserts offering routes for weapons shipments and clandestine meetings. Thus, Bilal operated in a matrix where every blueprint and shipment was touched by forces far larger than Gaza's narrow borders. Israel, for its part, perceived the conflict not merely as territorial but existential. Rockets landing in Ashkelon or Ashdod symbolized more than military nuisance. They represented the possibility of civilian vulnerability on a scale unacceptable to a state forged in the memory of siege. Every advancement in Hamas's arsenal, no matter how crude by conventional standards, was framed as an escalation requiring decisive response. Hence the obsession with men like Bilal Shukri. In the calculus of conflict, eliminating one engineer was cheaper than absorbing the cost of 1,000 rockets. The battlefield was not only physical, but intellectual, where knowledge itself became contraband. Sudan, where Bilal Shukri often found refuge, occupied a peculiar role in this chessboard. Under President Omar al-Bashir, Khartoum aligned with Iran, granting its territory as a corridor for weapons bound for Gaza. Cargo planes landed in Port Sudan under the guise of commercial traffic, unloading crates that disappeared into desert convoys. Sudanese intelligence was complicit at times, negligent at others, but either way, the nation became a pipeline for militants. Israel watched this flow with growing alarm, identifying Sudan not as a bystander but as an enabler of its enemies. Each rocket in Gaza, they argued, bore the dust of Khartoum. Iran, meanwhile, viewed figures like Bilal as investments in its proxy strategy. Tehran provided training, funds, and technical designs, embedding its influence into the very structure of Hamas's military capabilities. To Iran, rockets fired from Gaza were extensions of its own reach, a message to Israel and the West that pressure could be applied far from Persian soil. Syria played a complementary role, offering sanctuary for Hamas's political leadership and logistical channels for operatives like Bilal. Damascus became a halfway house for resistance, though the Syrian civil war would later fracture these alliances. Western powers positioned themselves uneasily. The United States, while avoiding direct involvement in targeted assassinations, shared intelligence with Israel and pressed allies to restrict Hamas's supply chains. European states condemned violence on both sides publicly, yet privately tightened airport watch lists, freezing suspected accounts linked to arms procurement. Egypt, straddling the line between mediator and adversary, alternated between turning a blind eye to tunnels and demolishing them under pressure. Each country's stance added threads to the web around Bilal, shrinking the spaces where he could operate freely. He became not just a man but a node in an international struggle, his movements tracked as carefully as his rockets. Bilal Shukri mattered because he was not replaceable. Commanders could be killed and quickly replaced, but minds like his were rare. He bridged the gap between ideology and technology, transforming raw ambition into tangible weapons. Each rocket he designed extended Hamas's reach, shrinking Israel's sense of security and amplifying Gaza's leverage. In conflicts defined by asymmetry, he was the great equalizer, a single man whose blueprints threatened to bend the battlefield. His role was not symbolic, it was measurable in kilometers of range, payload capacity, and the radius of fear spreading across Israeli cities. To Hamas, Bilal was the embodiment of resilience. He proved that ingenuity could overcome scarcity, that Gaza's isolation did not preclude innovation. Propaganda painted him as the modern David, wielding science instead of slings. His designs were showcased not as mere weapons but as statements of defiance. Each successful strike elevated morale, reinforcing the belief that resistance could evolve into deterrence. He became a legend in underground circles, his name invoked alongside martyrdom and victory, though he remained very much alive. That vitality made him more potent than any fallen hero. To Israel, Bilal was a ticking time bomb disguised as a man. Each day he lived meant another breakthrough, another shipment, another escalation. Eliminating him was not vengeance but necessity, an act of preemptive defense. Intelligence dossiers emphasized his pivotal role, concluding that his removal would slow Hamas's rocket program by years. His assassination was thus calculated not only as punishment, but as strategy, a way to cut arteries feeding the lifeblood of Gaza's militarization. His existence represented a risk too great to tolerate, a living equation that had to be erased. Globally, his death would resonate as proof of hidden wars shaping visible conflicts. Bilal symbolized how individuals became battlegrounds, their lives intersecting with the ambitions of nations. He was not a general commanding armies, yet his influence rippled across borders, altering strategies in Tel Aviv, Tehran, and Washington alike. His importance was disproportionate to his rank, precisely because he embodied what modern conflict demanded: innovation, secrecy, and persistence. This is why when he checked into the Al-Salam Rotana Hotel in Khartoum, Mossad did not see a guest. They saw a target whose elimination was overdue. In early April 2012, quiet preparations began. Flights landed in Khartoum International Airport, carrying passengers whose names would never appear on any real registry. They were Mossad operatives traveling under forged European passports, identities constructed with surgical precision. A man with the bearing of a German businessman carried documents listing his occupation as import consultant. A woman posing as a Canadian aid worker smiled politely through customs, her luggage neatly packed with ordinary clothes concealing specialized surveillance tools. Each arrival was staggered by days, never together, blending into the normal bustle of expatriates and contractors. The city they entered was a curious crossroads, dusty boulevards filled with battered taxis, bustling markets, and hotels where diplomats mingled with smugglers. Khartoum had long been a quiet theater of clandestine competition, where Iranian cargo flights touched down discreetly and Western agents monitored from the shadows. For Mossad, it was hostile but familiar ground, a stage upon which they had rehearsed variations of the same play before. The operatives rented apartments, frequented cafes, and purchased prepaid phones, constructing the illusion of ordinary lives while tightening their invisible circle around the target. Coordination came from Tel Aviv, where analysts tracked Bilal Shukri's movements with growing confidence. His preference for the Al-Salam Rotana Hotel, with its polished marble and international clientele, was a gift. Surveillance confirmed his reservations. Flights were cross-checked against databases, ensuring that no rival service could interfere. Every operative received precise instructions, down to which taxis to hail, which streets to avoid, and which hand gestures to use as signals in emergencies. The arrival phase was not dramatic. It was a quiet infiltration, an orchestra tuning its instruments before the symphony of a kill. By April 12, 2012, the Al-Salam Rotana Hotel had quietly filled with more than businessmen and diplomats. Among the guests were Mossad operatives, each cloaked in the anonymity of forged identities. One posed as a Lebanese telecom executive, carrying a laptop filled with harmless spreadsheets masking encrypted communication software. Another checked in under the guise of a French academic attending a regional trade forum. Their suitcases contained not only pressed shirts but also fiber-optic cameras, lockpicks disguised as pens, and small vials of odorless toxins sealed in medical kits. To the reception desk, they were polite travelers. To intelligence services, they were hunters in disguise. Surveillance began immediately. Operatives positioned themselves in the lobby, sipping coffee while tracking Bilal Shukri's movements. A woman with auburn hair occupied a corner table each morning, pretending to study documents but secretly recording his patterns. What time he descended for breakfast, which newspapers he chose, whether he spoke to staff in Arabic or English. Another operative, lodged 2 floors above his suite, used a modified stethoscope against the walls to monitor his conversations. The target was meticulous, but so were they. Every detail mattered. How long he lingered in the gym, what phone he used, whether he ordered room service or preferred to dine alone. The hotel's security system presented obstacles. Cameras in hallways were monitored by local staff, but Mossad had already prepared. A technician disguised as a contractor manipulated feeds, creating short intervals of blackout at carefully chosen times. Guests noticed nothing, yet in those gaps, operatives tested access points, practiced silent entries into unoccupied rooms, and planted invisible beacons to track movements. Shukri's world shrank into data points, each habit catalogued, each routine a potential vulnerability. Khartoum itself became part of the net. A driver posing as a taxi operator followed Bilal on his rare excursions outside the hotel, while another operative shadowed from market stalls. Even the waiters serving his tea were watched closely, in case he used them as couriers. By the time the surveillance stage ended, Mossad's team had mapped not only the contours of Bilal's life, but also the rhythm of his breaths. The hotel was no longer his refuge. It had become a cage. April 17, 2012, began like any other day inside the Al-Salam Rotana Hotel. The air was cool with recycled chill. Lobby chandeliers glittered above businessmen clutching briefcases, and staff moved briskly with trays of tea and sweet pastries. Bilal Shukri descended from his suite shortly after 9, wearing a pressed white shirt, his notebook tucked under his arm. He read the Sudan Tribune while sipping bitter coffee in the lobby, unaware that 3 pairs of eyes were fixed on him from different angles of the room. To him, it was a routine morning. To Mossad, It was the opening cue. By midday, Shukri retreated to his room, speaking briefly on his phone in hushed tones. Surveillance noted phrases suggesting a meeting scheduled for later that week, one involving technical transfers. The operatives interpreted it as confirmation. Eliminating him now would prevent an exchange of designs. Around 2 o'clock, a man posing as a German consultant rode the elevator to the 6th floor, exiting casually with a folded newspaper. Inside the paper lay a concealed keycard, cloned days earlier from hotel staff. Another operative lingered near the elevators, timing traffic to ensure the corridor remained empty. At 4 o'clock, the plan entered its critical phase. A blackout of hallway cameras began, triggered remotely by the disguised technician. The auburn-haired woman in the lobby signaled with a folded scarf, confirming Shukri had not left the premises. Upstairs, 2 operatives moved swiftly. One inserted the cloned keycard and entered his room, while the other stood watch at the stairwell. Shukri was inside, napping lightly on the bed. The strike team had less than 10 minutes to complete their work before surveillance resumed. By evening, the operation neared its climax. Guests in the lobby saw nothing unusual, only a handful of Europeans chatting by the bar, a Canadian aid worker making a call, a businessman checking his watch. Upstairs, however, the silence of room 614 carried the soundless thunder of history unfolding. The hunters had entered the cage, and the engineer's final chapter was being written not in diagrams or calculations, but in whispers and shadows. The arsenal Mossad brought into room 614 was not loud or theatrical. It was precise, elegant, and invisible to untrained eyes. The operatives carried lockpicks shaped as pens, fiber optic scopes no larger than shoelaces, and syringes fitted with microneedles that left almost no trace. One agent wore latex gloves pre-dusted with graphite powder to prevent fingerprints. Another carried a modified phone case capable of jamming wireless signals within a 20-meter radius, ensuring no emergency calls could leave the suite. Every object was dual purpose, mundane to the casual observer, lethal in the right hands. The toxins were stored in vials hidden inside a medical kit, labeled innocuously as vitamins. One compound, a derivative of succinylcholine, was chosen for its ability to paralyze muscles without immediate detection, simulating a sudden cardiac arrest. Another was a sedative designed to ensure compliance should resistance occur. Operatives rehearsed precise doses, measuring not by guesswork, but by calculations scribbled in coded notes. For them, chemistry was not science, but choreography, each milligram a step in a deadly dance. The environment itself became part of the toolset. The blackout of hallway cameras provided a 7-minute window, while the cloned keycard ensured silent entry. Inside the room, a miniature ultrasonic sensor swept for bugs, confirming Shukri had not set his own traps. Even the air conditioning vent was inspected, perfect for concealing a fiber camera in case the team needed secondary surveillance. Every detail was orchestrated to leave no ripples, to vanish as if nothing had happened. When the operatives withdrew, they carried only the faint weight of their tools. The pens returned to pockets, the vitamins sealed again, the cloned card slipped back into a wallet. In the language of espionage, the greatest triumph was invisibility. The guests at the bar, the waiters delivering trays of baklava, the receptionists greeting travelers. None would ever suspect that upstairs, technology and toxins had converged to alter the balance of conflict in the Middle East. The silence of the 6th floor was punctuated by ordinary sounds, the hum of an elevator, the soft shuffle of a housekeeper's cart, the distant murmur of televisions behind closed doors. Yet for the operatives, every sound was magnified into potential disaster. A knock on the wrong door, an accidental encounter in the corridor, a curious staff member asking questions. Any of these could unravel months of planning. One agent pretended to adjust his tie as a hotel maid walked past, hiding the tension behind a casual smile. She pushed her cart onward, oblivious to the history unfolding meters away. Inside room 614, the seconds stretched into eternity. Shukri stirred faintly on the bed, his breath shallow, his eyelids fluttering. One operative froze, syringe in hand, while another whispered a single word in coded Hebrew, instructing patience. The plan relied on flawless timing. Too soon, and the toxin's effects might draw suspicion. Too late, and surveillance systems would resume. Sweat beaded on foreheads despite the chill of the air conditioning. Every tick of the clock on the wall felt like a drumbeat in a theater, where the audience would never applaud. Downstairs, the auburn-haired woman in the lobby feigned boredom as she checked her watch. In truth, she was counting the exact duration of the blackout, ready to signal extraction if the window closed prematurely. Her eyes flicked toward the elevators, watching for any sign of trouble. At the bar, the German consultant ordered another drink, his hand resting lightly on a phone programmed to scramble local frequencies if alarms were raised. The choreography was seamless, yet fragile, balanced on the razor's edge of exposure. When the hallway cameras flickered back to life, nothing appeared amiss. Guests moved through the lobby, laughter echoed faintly, and the hotel hummed with normalcy. No one suspected that upstairs a man's fate had already been sealed in silence. The operatives had passed through shadows like phantoms, leaving behind no trace of struggle, no shattered furniture, no broken locks. Only time would reveal the truth, and by then, the hunters would already be gone. The end came swiftly, almost imperceptibly, as though Bilal Shukri's body had simply obeyed the mathematics of fate. The toxin slid into his bloodstream through a needle so fine it left only the faintest mark, hidden beneath a vein on his arm. Within minutes, his breathing slowed, his chest tightening as muscles betrayed him. To any observer, it resembled a sudden cardiac failure, the silent betrayal of a fatigued heart. He shifted slightly, eyes half opening, but there was no outcry, no struggle. His final sound was the faint exhale of air leaving lungs that would not refill. The operatives worked with cold efficiency. One adjusted his position on the bed to make it appear he had collapsed naturally during rest. Another placed his reading glasses neatly on the nightstand, as though he had set them down before sleep. The documents scattered near his luggage were gathered swiftly, photographed and returned exactly as found. Even the crease in the bedsheet was straightened. The room was staged not as a crime scene, but as a hotel suite that had simply witnessed the unremarkable death of a middle-aged man. They wiped every surface with gloved hands, careful to erase fingerprints. The syringe was dismantled, its fragments sealed in innocuous containers that disappeared into luggage bound for another continent. The cloned keycard was returned discreetly to a staff cart, ensuring no questions would arise about missing equipment. Within minutes, the hunters vanished the way they had arrived, quietly, invisibly, leaving behind only the still form of a man who had once terrified nations with nothing more than calculations. When the staff eventually entered, they found him lying as if in sleep, pale and unmoving with no sign of struggle. The doctor who was summoned declared it a probable heart attack. No alarms were raised, no suspicions voiced, not yet. For Mossad, it was the perfect finale. A death delivered in silence, disguised as nature's work, while the true architects of his fate walked calmly out of Khartoum, their mission completed. On the morning of April 18, 2012, housekeeping staff approached room 614 of the Al-Salam Rotana Hotel. The Do Not Disturb sign still hung on the door, unchanged from the night before. Knocks went unanswered, and after repeated calls to the room phone produced only silence, a supervisor arrived with a master key. The door opened to reveal a chilling stillness. Bilal Shukri lay on the bed, eyes half closed, his chest unmoving. To the untrained eye, it was the portrait of a man who had died in his sleep. The sheets were neatly arranged, his belongings intact, his glasses resting beside a folded newspaper. Panic spread quickly among staff. Within minutes, hotel management alerted Sudanese authorities, and security officers rushed to seal the floor. Guests peered curiously from doorways as men in uniform hurried past, radios crackling. Rumors began circulating in the lobby. A foreign guest had collapsed, a diplomat had been poisoned, a businessman had suffered a heart attack. Within an hour, whispers carried the truth. This was no ordinary guest. He was Bilal Shukri, a name whispered with awe and fear in intelligence circles. His death turned the elegant hotel into a theater of crisis, every chandelier and polished tile suddenly reflecting suspicion. Sudanese officials treated the discovery with both urgency and unease. They knew the implications of his presence in Khartoum and the consequences of his death on their soil. A physician summoned to the room pronounced death by apparent cardiac arrest, but the lack of disturbance unsettled investigators. How could a man known for caution and paranoia simply vanish into stillness? Why had the cameras in the corridor failed to record for critical minutes? The staff looked uneasy, the police suspicious, yet for now the official narrative was maintained. A natural death in a foreign land. The deeper truth had yet to surface. The body of Bilal Shukri was transported under heavy guard to a Khartoum morgue, where Sudanese pathologists prepared for examination. Outwardly, nothing suggested foul play. No bruises, no lacerations, no signs of forced entry or violent struggle. His skin bore only a faint pinprick on the inside of his arm, so small it escaped initial notice. The first report listed acute cardiac arrest as the probable cause of death, a verdict tidy enough to close the case. Yet whispers among intelligence officers demanded more. A man of his stature did not simply die quietly in a hotel bed. The second examination was more meticulous. Toxicology samples were drawn from blood, urine, and tissue. Within days, anomalies surfaced. Traces of neuromuscular inhibitors consistent with rare synthetic compounds, substances unlikely to be found in any pharmacy. The concentrations were low, calibrated with precision, enough to silence muscles without obvious residue. Sudanese authorities grew nervous. To admit poisoning would implicate foreign agents operating freely within their capital. To dismiss it would invite suspicion of a cover-up. The file was quietly sealed, the results classified, leaving only fragments leaked to sympathetic journalists. Forensic investigators noted another peculiarity. His body temperature at discovery suggested death had occurred hours earlier than reported. This mismatch hinted at staging. The arrangement of the room, the neatly folded newspaper, the undisturbed sheets, all signs of deliberate preparation. Those who examined the evidence saw the invisible choreography of professionals, a death designed to look natural. But in the margins of the autopsy notes, one physician scribbled a single line. This was not the work of nature. The phrase circulated privately, fueling speculation that Sudan had been chosen as the stage precisely because its silence could be bought. When Sudanese security services reviewed the hotel's surveillance footage, they discovered troubling gaps. Cameras on the sixth-floor corridor, usually reliable, flickered into blackness during critical windows on April 17th. The outage lasted exactly 7 minutes, long enough for entry, execution, and exit. Engineers insisted no technical malfunction could have caused such precision. The blackout was not accident, but sabotage. Investigators widened their review, scanning lobby and elevator feeds. There they saw foreign guests entering and leaving with impeccable timing, faces unfamiliar to local registries. They had signed in with European passports, each appearing genuine, yet none matching official consular records. Whispers began of a passport scandal. British, French, and German embassies were quietly contacted. Officials denied any nationals were involved, but cross-checks revealed the documents were forgeries of startling quality. Some contained authentic numbers stolen from real citizens abroad, others fabricated entirely. The resemblance to previous Mossad operations was uncanny. Journalists recalled the 2010 assassination of Mahmoud al-Mabhouh in Dubai, where cloned European passports had exposed Israel's shadow networks. The parallels were undeniable. Multiple operatives, synchronized movements, forged identities, and surveillance blackouts timed to the second. Sudan's security establishment recognized the pattern, though they hesitated to speak it aloud. As footage circulated discreetly among intelligence allies, foreign capitals grew restless. European governments demanded explanations from Israel, though none expected honest answers. Diplomats muttered about violations of sovereignty, while privately conceding admiration for the operation's precision. For Sudan, the scandal was a humiliation. Their capital had hosted a foreign hit squad, their premier hotel turned into a stage for assassination, their security systems bypassed with ease. Every missing frame of footage, every forged passport, was evidence not only of Mossad's reach, but of Sudan's vulnerability. And in the corridors of power, the question grew sharper. Who else was being hunted in the shadows? The death of Bilal Shukri did not remain a local mystery. Within days, the story spread from Khartoum to global headlines. Arab media outlets framed it as another chapter in Israel's long campaign of extraterritorial assassinations. drawing parallels to earlier hits in Beirut and Dubai. Hamas issued fiery statements declaring Shukri a martyr of resistance and vowing retaliation. In Gaza, his name became a rallying cry, his face plastered on posters, his legend sealed by the manner of his death. Israel, as always, remained silent, neither confirming nor denying. Their silence was louder than any admission. Diplomatic tremors followed swiftly. Sudan summoned the Israeli ambassador in absentia. Israel had no official presence in Khartoum to condemn the violation of sovereignty. Iran accused Israel of waging war on the scientists of resistance, vowing that others would rise to continue Shukri's work. European capitals, embarrassed by the passport forgeries, issued stern warnings to Tel Aviv. Yet behind closed doors, intelligence channels remained active, quietly sharing data that confirmed the operation's brilliance. Publicly, they scolded. Privately, they marveled. It was a dance of outrage and admiration, played out in the language of international theater. For Mossad, the fallout was calculated collateral. Their operatives had vanished without trace, their methods revealed only in fragments. The assassination reinforced their reputation. No target was beyond reach, no border impermeable, no passport unforgeable. For Hamas, the loss was catastrophic. Shukri's death disrupted weapons development, forcing the group to rely on less experienced engineers. Projects stalled, trajectories shortened, and morale wavered. Yet paradoxically, his absence also fueled resolve. His legend became part of the movement's mythology, ensuring that his ghost would continue haunting Israel's security calculus. In the end, the global fallout confirmed what both sides already knew. Espionage was not bound by borders, and assassinations were as much political theater as military necessity. Shukri's death in Khartoum exposed Sudan's role as a clandestine corridor, strained Israel's ties with Europe, and reminded the world that the Middle East's conflicts were not confined to its borders. They stretched into hotel lobbies, airport terminals, and the quiet anonymity of distant cities. The shadow war had no front lines, only footprints that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Behind the assassination of Bilal Shukri lay not merely operatives with forged passports and vials of poison, but an invisible machinery, an empire without borders, built on paperwork, secrecy, and silence. This was the phantom bureaucracy of intelligence, a labyrinth where memos could kill and signatures carried the weight of death sentences. It operated from fluorescent-lit offices in Tel Aviv, London, Washington, and Tehran, where analysts sifted data not for curiosity, but for targets. Here, committees of unseen clerks turned surveillance into dossiers, and dossiers into operations. Entire wars were waged in filing cabinets and encrypted servers, invisible to those who walked the streets above. The phantom bureaucracy thrived on ambiguity. No mission was written in plain words, every authorization cloaked in euphemism. Special measures, technical adjustments, foreign contingencies, phrases that masked assassinations under the veil of administration. Its power came from distance. A man in Khartoum might be struck dead, yet the decision that sealed his fate originated in sterile conference rooms thousands of miles away. Responsibility dissolved into layers: case officers, section chiefs, deputy directors, ministers. Each one left just enough of a fingerprint to claim efficiency, yet never enough to invite culpability. This was the bureaucracy's genius: killing by committee, yet leaving no committee visible. It is easy to imagine assassins as lone wolves moving through shadows, but in truth they are the tip of a pyramid supported by invisible legions of clerks, translators, logisticians, and accountants. Someone filed the reimbursement for the cloned keycard, someone approved the hotel expenses, someone else signed off on the purchase of syringes labeled as medical training supplies. The kill was an act of theater, but the stagehands were bureaucrats in suits, moving papers that carried the weight of lives. History is haunted not only by assassins, but by those who sharpen pens instead of knives. If the phantom bureaucracy was the mind, the invisible legions were the muscle. These were not armies in uniform, but specialized cadres trained to exist in silence. Mossad's Kidon unit, often described in hushed tones, embodied the archetype of assassins, masters of disguise fluent in multiple languages, experts with toxins and suppressed weapons. They were mythologized as phantoms who could slip through airports with forged passports, dine at cafes unnoticed, and end lives with the precision of surgeons. To their handlers, they were assets. To their enemies, they were nightmares that walked in daylight. Beyond Mossad, other shadows moved. Iran's Quds force operated like a clandestine empire, deploying advisors and smuggling routes, turning militias into proxies. The CIA's Special Activities Center, though cloaked in bureaucratic blandness, functioned as a modern guild of saboteurs, fielding operatives skilled at covert action and deniable warfare. Even European services, often dismissed as secondary players, cultivated elite surveillance teams, intercept specialists, and cyber operatives who struck invisibly. Each unit carried its own mythology, whispered within intelligence circles, where reputations became deterrents as powerful as weapons. Profiles of these operatives read like characters from an espionage noir. One was said to dismantle locks blindfolded in under a minute. Another could alter her gait to mimic different ages, moving through crowds like a shifting ghost. Some were known for their patience, staking out targets for months, blending so deeply into cities they became part of the scenery. They did not march in parades or appear in medal ceremonies. Their triumphs were known only in files stamped top secret, their failures erased with silence. They were the invisible legions, soldiers without flags, bound by nothing but orders delivered in whispers. The death of Bilal Shukri was not an isolated aria, but another verse in a long, unfinished song of shadow wars. Echoes of old missions hung over it like ghosts. In 1960, Adolf Eichmann was snatched from a Buenos Aires street by Mossad operatives posing as mechanics, bundled into a car, and flown to Israel for trial. In 1973, in Lillehammer, Norway, an innocent waiter was mistakenly executed in the belief he was a Black September mastermind, an error that revealed how fallible even the invisible legions could be. Each success and failure alike carved scars into the annals of clandestine history. The 1997 botched poisoning of Khaled Mashal in Amman, where Mossad agents disguised as Canadian tourists injected toxins into his ear, haunted Israel's playbook. The operatives were caught, the scandal exposed, and only U.S. pressure forced Israel to deliver the antidote to save Mashal's life. In contrast, the 2010 Dubai assassination of Mahmoud al-Mabhouh displayed the choreography of perfection. Operatives entering with forged passports, disabling locks, injecting a paralytic, and leaving the room as if nothing had happened. Yet even that mission left traces: grainy CCTV footage, exposed aliases, embarrassed governments. Each mission was both legend and cautionary tale. Other agencies had their echoes too. The CIA's Phoenix program in Vietnam, designed to dismantle Viet Cong networks, left behind haunting accounts of targeted killings and betrayals. The Russian FSB carried forward the tradition of poison: Alexander Litvinenko's slow death in London, Sergei Skripal's near-fatal collapse in Salisbury. Each episode revealed the same truth: states wage their wars through invisible hands, crafting deaths as messages as much as eliminations. In the darkness of espionage, history never ended. It repeated, refined, rehearsed. The Khartoum hotel room was simply the latest stage, another act in an eternal theater of shadows. Above the assassins, beyond the analysts, sat the gods behind the curtain, leaders who pulled strings with trembling hands. Prime ministers, presidents, generals, flawed mortals cloaked in the illusion of omnipotence. They spoke of security, deterrence, and national interest, yet their orders sealed fates in hotel rooms thousands of miles away. Theirs was a power both awesome and brittle, for every success carried political currency, and every failure risked scandal. They were not omniscient masterminds, but gamblers with human egos, playing chess with lives as pawns. In their shadow, Bilal Shukri's death was less a climax than a move in an endless game. When Bilal Shukri's body was returned to Gaza, it arrived draped in flags, escorted by chants that filled the narrow streets. His funeral drew thousands, a river of mourners surging past bullet-pocked walls and shuttered shops. Imams declared him a martyr, a son of Palestine whose mind had been his weapon. Women wailed from balconies, young men raised fists, and masked militants fired rifles into the air. His coffin, carried on shoulders, was paraded like an emblem of defiance. The man who had once lived in the shadows now lay in public view, transformed into symbol, legend, and rallying cry. Hamas leaders seized the moment, delivering speeches that elevated Shukri to the pantheon of resistance heroes. They described him as the architect of fear, the man who turned wires into war and scarcity into strength. His funeral was not mere mourning but a declaration that his work would continue. In backrooms, commanders pledged to accelerate weapons programs, to honor his memory by extending the reach of their rockets even further. Yet amid the rhetoric, silence hung heavy. None could deny that his death left a void not easily filled. His genius had been singular, his absence irreplaceable. The immediate impact reverberated beyond Gaza. Israeli officials monitored the funeral with a mix of caution and satisfaction. Crowds chanting against Tel Aviv confirmed that their enemy had lost a vital figure, but also that the mythology of martyrdom had been amplified. Regional governments, uneasy about unrest spilling across borders, tightened security. Western analysts noted how the spectacle hardened divisions rather than softened them. Shukri's funeral was both an end and a beginning, an end to his personal chapter, and the beginning of his transformation into symbol. His body was buried, but his legend, carried on the wind of chance, refused to rest. In the years after Bilal Shukri's death, his absence reshaped the battlefield in ways both immediate and enduring. Hamas's rocket program suffered temporary paralysis, its development slowed by the loss of his technical mastery. Projects that once advanced with precision faltered, prototypes misfired, and apprentices struggled to replicate his calculations. Israeli analysts noted the lull with relief, yet warned that knowledge had already been dispersed. Shukri's notebooks, his lessons, his apprentices, all became seeds scattered into the underground laboratories of Gaza. His death delayed progress, but it did not extinguish it. The machine he built kept grinding, even without its architect. Power vacuums emerged within Hamas's ranks. Younger engineers jostled for prominence, each claiming fragments of Shukri's legacy. Rivalries grew, and with them, mistakes, botched launches, accidental explosions, miscalculations that wounded their own fighters. For Israel, these failures were victories in silence. Yet in time, new figures rose, borrowing from Shukri's methods while adding innovations of their own. The wheel of conflict turned again, proving that individuals could be killed, but ideas endured. The engineer became less a man and more a template, a model for future generations to follow in the clandestine marriage of science and struggle. Geopolitically, his death hardened the precedent of extraterritorial assassinations. Sudan, embarrassed and humiliated, distanced itself from Iran, wary of being a stage for foreign operations. European states tightened passport controls, scrutinizing documents with suspicion, aware that their identities had once again been weaponized. Israel, emboldened by success, reaffirmed the doctrine that no sanctuary was safe for enemies deemed existential threats. The message was clear: geography provided no shield, neutrality, no refuge. Shukri's death became both case study and warning, cited in intelligence briefings long after the echoes of his funeral chants faded. In the end, Bilal Shukri's death changed little in the grand scheme of geopolitics. Rockets still arced over borders, wars still erupted in cycles, and nations continued their shadow games. Yet his assassination peeled back the veil, revealing the hidden world where men are hunted not for what they have done, but for what they might build. It was a reminder that in the age of intelligence warfare, knowledge itself is dangerous, and a mind can be as threatening as an army. Governments sanction killers, bureaucracies file death warrants, and the truth, like the man in room 614, remains buried in the shadows.